the Indo-Aryans, the natives, the invaders, the village community, caste, warriors, priests, merchants, workers, outcasts. Despite the continuity of the remains at Sind and Mysore, we feel that between the heyday of Mohenjo-daro and the advent of the Aryans, a great gap stands in our knowledge. Or rather, that our knowledge of the past is an occasional gap in our ignorance. Among the Indus relics is a peculiar seal, composed of 2 serpent heads, which was the characteristic symbol of the oldest historic people of India, those serpent-worshipping Nagas, whom the invading Aryans found in possession of the northern provinces, and whose descendants still linger in the remoter hills. Farther south, the land was occupied by dark-skinned, broad-nosed people whom, without knowing the origin of the word, we call Dravidians. They were already a civilized people when the Aryans broke down upon them. Their adventurous merchants sailed the sea, even to Sumeria and Babylon, and their cities knew many refinements and luxuries. It was from them, apparently, that the Aryans took their village community and their systems of land tenure and taxation. To this day, the Deccan is still essentially Dravidian, in stock and customs, in language, literature, and in arts. The invasion and conquest of these flourishing tribes by the Aryans was part of that ancient process whereby, periodically, the North has swept down violently upon the settled and pacified South. This has been one of the main streams of history on which civilizations have risen and fallen like epochal undulations. The Aryans poured down upon the Dravidians, the Achaeans and Dorians upon the Cretans and Aegeans, the Germans upon the Romans, and the English upon the rest of the world. Forever the North produces rulers and warriors, the South produces artists and saints, and the meek inherit heaven. Who were these marauding Aryans? They themselves used the term as meaning nobleman, Sanskrit Arya, noble. But perhaps this patriotic derivation is one of those afterthoughts which cast scandalous gleams of humor into philology. Monier Williams derives Aryan from the Sanskrit root riar, to plow. Reference the Latin aratrum, a plow, and area, an open space. On this theory, the word Aryan originally meant not nobleman, but peasant. Very probably, these Aryans came from that Caspian region which their Persian cousins called Aryanavejo, the Aryan home. We find such typically Vedic deities as Indra, Mitra, and Varuna mentioned in a treaty concluded by the Aryan Hittites in Mitannians at the beginning of the 14th century BC. And so characteristic of Vedic ritual as drinking of the sacred jasoma juice is repeated in the Persian ceremony of drinking the sap of the hauma plant. The Sanskrit S corresponds regularly to Zend or Persian H. Soma becomes hauma, as Sindhu becomes Hindu. We conclude that the Mitannians, the Hittites, the Kassites, the Sogdians, the Bactrians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Aryan invaders of India were branches of an already heterogeneous Indo-European stock which spread out from the shores of the Caspian Sea. About the same time that the Aryan Kassites overran Babylonia, the Vedic Aryans began to enter India. Like the Germans invading Italy, these Aryans were rather immigrants than conquerors, but they brought with them strong physiques, a hearty appetite in both liquids and solids, a ready brutality, of skill and courage in war, and all of this soon gave them the mastery of northern India. They fought with bows and arrows, led by armored warriors and chariots, who wielded battle axes or hurled spears. They were too primitive to be hypocrites. They subjugated India without pretending to elevate it. They wanted land and pasture for their cattle. Their word for war said nothing about natural honor, but simply meant a desire for more cows. Slowly, they made their way eastward along the Indus and the Ganges until all Hindustan was under their control. As they passed from armed warfare to settled tillage, their tribes gradually coalesced into petty states. Each state was ruled by a king, checked by a council of warriors. Each tribe was led by a raja, or chieftain, limited in his power by a tribal council. Each tribe was composed of a comparatively independent set of village communities governed by an assembly of family heads. Have you heard, Ananda, Buddha is represented as asking his Saint John, that the Vaishyans foregather often in frequent public meetings of their clans? So long, Ananda, as the Vaishyans foregather thus often and frequent the public meetings of their clans, so long may they be expected not to decline, but to prosper. Like all peoples, the Aryans had rules of endogamy and exogamy, forbidding marriage outside the racial group, or within near degrees of kinship. From these rules came the most characteristic of Hindu institutions. Outnumbered by a people whom they considered inferior to themselves, the Aryans foresaw that without restrictions on intermarriage, they would soon lose their racial identity. In a century or two, they would be assimilated. The first caste division, therefore, was not by status, but by color. It divided long noses from broad noses, Aryans from Nagas and Dravidians. It was merely the marriage regulation of an endogamous group. In its later profusion of hereditary, racial, and occupational divisions, the caste system hardly existed in Vedic times. Among the Aryans themselves, marriage, except of their near kin, was free, and status was not defined by birth. As Vedic India, 2000 to 1000 BC, passed into what is known as the Heroic Age, 1000 to 500 BC, as India changed from the conditions pictured in the Vedas into those in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, occupations became more specialized and hereditary, and caste divisions were more rigidly defined. At the top were the Kshatriyas, or fighters, who held it a sin to die in bed. Even the religious ceremonials were in the early days performed by kings or chieftains, in the fashion of Sever playing Pontifex. The Brahmins, or priests, were then mere assistants of the sacrifice. In the Ramayana, a Kshatriya protests passionately against mating a proud and peerless bride of warrior stock to a prating priest and Brahmin. The Jain books take for granted the leadership of the Kshatriyans, and Buddhist literature goes so far as to call the Brahmins lowborn. Even in India, things change. But as war gradually gave way to peace, and as religion, being then largely an aid to agriculture in the face of the incalculable elements, grew in social importance and ritual complexity, and required expert intermediaries between gods and men, the Brahmins increased in number, wealth, and power. As educators of the young, and oral transmitters of the race's history, literature, and laws, they were able to recreate the past and form the future into their own image, molding each generation into greater reverence for their priests, and building for their caste a prestige which would, in later centuries, give them the supreme place in Indian society. Already, in Buddha's time, they had begun to challenge the supremacy of the Kshatriyas. They pronounced these warriors inferior, even as the Kshatriyas pronounced the priests inferior. And Buddha felt that there was much to be said for both points of view. Even in Buddha's time, however, the Kshatriyas had not conceded intellectual leadership to the Brahmins, and the Buddhist movement itself, founded by a Kshatriya noble, contested the religious hegemony of India with the Brahmins for 1,000 years. Below these ruling minorities were the Vaisyas, merchants and freemen, hardly distinct as a caste before Buddha, the Shudras. The Shudras, or working men, who comprised most of the native population, and finally the outcasts, or pariahs, unconverted native tribes like the Chandalas, war captives, and men reduced to slavery as a punishment. Out of this originally small group of casteless men grew the 40 million untouchables of India today.